Chapter 1. The Weight of Bread, Labor, Grain, and the Agrarian Foundation. Nesu stood knee-deep in the receding mud after the Nile flood. He ignored distant monuments, focusing instead on the damp earth that would soon harden under the sun. With an ox-drawn ard, he plowed quickly before the heat made planting impossible. Beneath the blistering sun, Nesu's hands tremble within the muddy banks, guiding the shallow irrigation canals that carve through the dry earth. This is the hidden infrastructure of the kingdom, invisible to tourists who gaze only at the distant monuments. Here, survival is measured in spoonfuls of silt and baskets of water dragged from the Nile's receding edge. Neighbors fall into a synchronized, exhausted rhythm, their bodies moving as one weary organism against the relentless heat. If they stop, the soil cracks and the crops wither. There is no margin for rest, only the continuous, unglamorous struggle to capture every drop of life from the drying riverbed. Months dragged by until the emmer stalks turned brittle under a merciless white-hot sky. Nesu knelt in the dust, his hands already raw and blistered from months of planting, and drew his flint sickle across the thick stems. The sound was a dry rasp, not a celebration. Each bundle weighed not in coin, but in desperate caloric value. He tied them tight, eyes darting to the horizon, knowing the wind and scavenging birds waited with patient hunger for any stray grain left behind. Royal surveyors arrive on sturdy donkeys, their white linen robes startlingly pristine against the dust of the field. They carry long measuring rods and clay tablets, marking themselves as officials of the state rather than fellow laborers. With calm detachment, they stand before Nesu's mound of harvested emmer wheat. This is not a request, it is an extraction. The surveyors calculate rigid percentages based on years of flood data. Nesu watches helplessly as his family's survival is poured into the high walls of the royal granary, leaving him only enough to sustain his own body while the state secures its future. Back in his mud brick home, Nesu's wife threshes the remaining grain with a wooden flail. They bake dense, gritty emmer bread and brew low-alcohol beer. These are not delicacies, they are fuel. The food is simple, monotonous, and essential for maintaining the physical capacity to work another day. The notice posted in the village square was not a request. Nesu and his neighbors were already conscripted, their bodies repurposed as state property before the harvest was fully secured. The grain stored in the granary served as the silent ledger for this transaction. Their fields sat empty, waiting for a master who no longer needed them to farm. Instead, the surplus food justified their displacement, transforming human labor into raw material for monuments that glorified the very system that pulled them away from their homes. The physical weight of a basket of grain is identical to that of a stone block. Nesu carries both, his back bowing under the load. He realizes his strength feeds the priests who write laws and the artisans who carve stones he hauls. The hierarchy is not virtue, but the flow of calories from his labor to their desks. Nesu does not look at the distant pyramid with awe. He calculates the tons of grain required to feed the workers who built it, a sum that could have kept his family fed for years. The stone stands static and eternal, but his power lies in the mud caked to his boots. The monument is merely the echo. He is the voice. Without his bending back, the pyramid would be nothing but dust and silence. Chapter 2. The Hierarchy of Dust, Social Stratification in Daily Life. From the temple ramparts, the city reveals its rigid anatomy. Below, the artisan quarter hugs the earth in windowless mud brick blocks, dense and unyielding against the dust. Above, the nobility's stone-clad villas rise on terraces, their columned courtyards open to the sky. Space itself dictates rank, segregating lives before a single word is spoken. In the crowded market, rank was visible before a word was spoken. Laborers wore coarse, undyed linen that chafed against rough skin, while elites draped themselves in fine, pleated white linen heavy with gold jewelry. These materials were not merely fashion but immutable uniforms. The weight of metal and the tightness of weave served as immediate public indicators of social position, locking everyone into a fixed order that no amount of money could easily breach or obscure. Consider the stark divide in sustenance that reinforced every social stratum. A labourer's day began with dense emmer bread and thin, watery beer, a fueling necessity designed merely to survive the fields. In contrast, the noble's table groaned under roasted meats, spiced wines, and honey cakes. This was not mere preference but economic dominance. Food became the ultimate boundary, making privilege visible on every plate and ensuring that even digestion reflected an immutable hierarchy. True advancement in this rigid society was rarely inherited. It was carved from stone and papyrus, demanding years of grueling discipline that few could afford. A scribe's desk represented a fragile ladder out of agricultural labor, accessible only to those who possessed the rare wealth to fund an education that others simply did not have. In the ancient courts, a woman's legal voice depended entirely on her class. An elite wife stood as an independent citizen. She signed contracts, managed estates, and sold property without requiring permission from any man. Her life was governed by law, not subservience. In stark contrast, a female servant possessed no such agency. Bound to her master's household, she worked under strict control with zero autonomy. For her, biology offered equality in need, but the law provided no protection. The rigid hierarchy of society erased any possibility of personal freedom for the lower classes. The granaries hummed with the weight of harvested grain and slaughtered cattle, a tangible testament to the rigid hierarchy that defined ancient life. Nobles and priests stood at the apex, collecting their tithes not as charity, but as the necessary price for stability. Peasants, bound to the soil, relied on these very same storehouses for security during lean times. This economic loop was both a burden and a lifeline, sustaining the state's power while cementing the unbreakable chains of class that dictated every aspect of their survival. While a scribe's reed brush offers a faint ladder for the exceptionally gifted, this path remains dangerously narrow and largely inaccessible. The economic interdependence that sustains the state does not grant freedom, it merely binds labor to the soil with unbreakable chains of debt and duty. For the vast majority, birth dictates destiny more firmly than talent ever could. Hierarchical markers in architecture and attire solidify this reality, proving that while a few might ascend, the rigid social order remains fundamentally immovable for most citizens. Society was a pyramid of flesh and stone. The pharaoh's linen gleamed in the sun while the laborer wore rough wool. Noble women drank wine from gold cups. Peasant wives ground grain with stone querns. Status was not just wealth but biology. Your birth fixed your place. You could not climb. The rich ate meat daily. The poor ate bread and onions. This hierarchy was as real as the bricks underfoot, immutable and absolute for every soul. Chapter 3. The scribe's ink and the artisan's chisel, tools of trade and social mobility. To escape manual labor in ancient Egypt, one had to master the disciplined technical skill of literacy. This was not abstract learning, but a precise trade requiring specific tools and quiet environments. In a dim scriptorium, a young apprentice ground charcoal on a pottery shard, rehearsing the hierarchical curves of the Middle Kingdom alphabet. A senior scribe stood close by, his reed stylus correcting the boy's grip, reinforcing that education was a repetitive physical practice, essential for social mobility. The senior official carefully unrolled the fragile sheet of papyrus within the Hall of Records. With steady hands, he applied a circle of red ochre to seal the document, binding its authority in physical form. This tangible weight and texture represented legal power far beyond mere ink. In stark contrast stood the apprentice outside, holding only his practiced shards of pottery, reminding all who watched that true privilege lay in controlling the very medium through which history was recorded and distributed. In the dust-choked silence of Deir el-Medina, a master stonecutter paused for a fleeting breath. His bronze chisel bit into the limestone with practiced force, sending fine powder swirling into the dry air. He watched it settle into the deep lines of his weathered face, calculating the day's quota with grim precision. Every strike was a transaction, every chip of rock a direct deposit into the royal granary's rations. This was not art, it was survival, measured in stone and sustained by the relentless promise of bread. The artisan's day ended with a measured loaf and a small jar of beer, handed over via state ration card. His physical toll compensated in basic sustenance. The scribe, however, received premium grain, fresh imported fish, and better wine, proving that intellectual labor commanded superior material rewards within the economic ecosystem. Consider the metalworker standing before his furnace. The heat is oppressive, radiating against his skin with every breath. His work demands physical strength, governed by the rhythm of fire and the weight of bronze as he strikes and shapes the metal. It is loud, hazardous labor, confined to the scorching confines of the workshop. Now imagine the scribe seated in the cool shade. No furnace burns here. His world is quiet, defined only by the scratch of reed on papyrus. He wears no protective gear, for his tool is delicate. While the artisan battles elemental forces, the scribe wrestles with syntax and grammar. His movements are fluid, not forceful. This contrast defines their lives. One is mobile, exposed to danger, driven by muscle. The other is sedentary, precise, governed by discipline. Both require skill, but their daily realities could not be more different. In Deir el-Medina, life did not stop at the workman's door. When a neighbor moved a boundary stone, claiming extra land for his olive press, the community did not wait for the vizier's decree to arrive from Thebes. Instead, they gathered beneath the cool shadow of the tomb pyramid, enforcing their own internal rules and civic autonomy, proving that even amidst royal labor, they possessed a distinct legal agency independent of state bureaucracy. In the crowded household courtyard, a female artisan worked her loom, weaving linen while balancing childcare duties that defined her daily rhythm. Her life was tethered to the home, yet vital to the economy. Meanwhile, a rare female priestess navigated the segregated sacred spaces of the temple, wielding influence through ritual and record-keeping. These women operated within male-dominated hierarchies, but carved out distinct spheres of authority, one through domestic production, the other through religious sanctity. The artisan's chisel shapes the limestone that will hold the scribe's ink, while the scribe's ledger validates the artisan's right to keep his tools. Their lives are economically interlocked despite their social distance. Education remains the quiet path out of labor for both. One carves the stone, the other records it. Both serve the state, converging in a shared dependency that binds society together through mutual need and administrative order. Chapter 4: The Body in Service, Health, Danger, and the Medical Craft. In the hushed air of a temple clinic, survival depended on two parallel paths. As a priest intoned invocations to Sekhmet for spiritual cleansing, a physician applied a poultice of moldy bread and honey to an infected wound. This was not contradiction, but necessity. Empirical treatment addressed the flesh, while magic sought the spirit's favor. Together, they formed a comprehensive defense against the fragility that threatened every life in ancient Egypt. Life's toll was written on the body, but the script differed by trade. A scribe sat hunched for hours, fingers stained with ink, eyes burning from staring at papyrus, back stiffening into a permanent curve. He rubbed his temples, seeking relief from the dull ache behind them. Nearby, a stonemason wiped silica dust from his lips, coughing deeply into the dry air. His thumb was swollen and bruised from the hammer's relentless strike, a badge of every stone laid. One suffered the slow strain of the mind, the other, the sharp immediate wound of the tool. Beyond the city walls, the story changed. Farmers waded through nutrient-rich irrigation waters for hours each day. The mud carried schistosoma parasites that burrowed into their skin. Blood loss and fever became chronic companions of survival. Meanwhile, nobles rested in shaded pavilions, insulated by wealth from the invisible biological threats that dictated the pace of life for those who worked the soil. While the wealthy worried about the specific dangers of their high-status foods, every Egyptian shared a common oral struggle. Emmer bread was ground on stone querns, which inevitably wore down to gritty sand. This abrasive dust mixed with the dough, creating a rough texture that slowly eroded teeth over a lifetime. It was a universal wear and tear, leveling the physical experience of eating across all social strata, binding rich and poor in a shared, silent ache. Midwives navigated a perilous landscape where life and death hung by a thread. Armed with knowledge of herbs and protective amulets, they managed childbirth complications with skilled hands. Yet their role carried a heavy price. While men held safer positions in society, women faced the grim reality of high mortality rates during delivery. Their bodies bore the disproportionate risk, making every birth a critical confrontation with vulnerability. For the elite, natron was more than a preservative. It was a daily ritual of purification, scrubbing away sweat and scent before stepping into the cool, tiled public baths that signaled high status. But for the labourer building those very walls, water was a luxury kept back in clay jars at home. Without that steady stream, skin infections festered unchecked. This stark divide did more than separate social classes. It etched vulnerability directly onto the body, turning hygiene into a visible marker of who could afford to stay clean and who could not. Gold wires secured loose teeth in wealthy mouths, a practical repair for daily life that quietly mirrored the grander ambition of mummification. Just as the artisan stabilized the living jaw, the embalmers prepared the dead body for eternity. Both acts sought the same enduring goal, preserving physical integrity against decay, bridging the fragile gap between immediate survival and eternal order through careful, deliberate care. Every Egyptian understood that the body was fragile, requiring both skilled hands and divine favor for survival. This dual reliance established health not merely as a personal condition, but as the central stake in their cosmic order. To be well was to maintain social standing and ensure spiritual continuity after death. Thus, the pervasive threat of disease bound all classes together in a shared anxiety, where physical preservation became essential for eternal survival. Chapter 5. The Architecture of the Household, Domestic Hierarchy and Gender Roles. The ordinary Egyptian home was a deliberate container, built of mud brick to shield the family from the harsh sun. You entered through a low doorway, forcing every guest into an involuntary bow. Inside, the main room stood supported by central pillars, with grain storage pits dug deep into the earth floor, ensuring the household's survival against famine. As day turned to scorching heat, the upper terrace became the true living space, offering a cooler sanctuary for sleep and evening conversation. This physical structure was not merely shelter, but a strategic boundary that preserved daily life and social hierarchy within its walls. Unlike Greek women trapped in domestic silence, Egyptian wives held real power. They owned land, ran businesses, and could sue for divorce alone. A woman's legal autonomy was not a gift from men, but a foundational right. This independence built the household's resilience. The home stood firm because its keeper had the law on her side. Without this agency, the family structure would have collapsed under economic or social pressure. Their contracts were sealed by female witnesses, cementing a society where gender did not dictate worth. The household functioned as a key economic engine, driven by the wife's administrative authority over vital resources. She carefully supervised the textile production cycles, ensuring wool and flax were processed into wearable garments for the entire family. Simultaneously, she managed the granary pits established in the previous structure, allocating precise rations of grain to each dependent. This daily oversight transformed legal rights into physical survival, directly preserving the family's health and continuity through meticulous control of food and materials. In the quiet heart of every home stood a small sacred space, a hidden sanctuary designed to protect the family from unseen dangers. Here, ordinary people placed faience statuettes of Bes, the dwarf god with his protruding tongue, and Tawa, the fierce hippopotamus goddess. These colorful figures were not mere decorations, they served as powerful spiritual guardians. Their presence was believed to ward off demons and evil spirits that sought to harm the family within their walls, ensuring that the physical vessel of the household remained safe from cosmic threats in a world filled with vulnerability. In the crowded warrens of ancient cities, economic survival dictated the shape of home life for the working poor. Families pooled resources in extended compound arrangements, sharing walls and courtyards to maximize limited space and labor. This communal structure provided essential support networks that nuclear households simply could not afford. Conversely, wealthier citizens enjoyed greater privacy within smaller, independent units. These distinct social boundaries defined the domestic sphere, balancing individual autonomy against collective security in a harsh urban environment. In the quiet corner of the family home, long before a child ever stepped into the cold halls of a formal scribal school or a guild workshop, the first lessons were already taking shape. Here, amidst the rhythm of daily chores and the scent of baking bread, parents became the primary architects of their offspring's future. With simple reeds or wooden tablets borrowed from the household's limited supplies, young fingers learned to press symbols into soft clay. This early numeracy taught them not just counting, but order. They memorized multiplication tables while helping to sort grain measures, blending arithmetic with agriculture. Literacy followed, often sparked by the practical need to read labels on jar seals or list goods in household ledgers. A domestic tutor might guide their hand, correcting strokes with gentle patience, ensuring the characters flowed correctly. It was a slow, patient process, where error meant starting over. The home served as the first classroom, where the seeds of trade, administration, and cultural identity were sown long before professional training began. Through this intimate instruction, the family ensured that the next generation carried forward not just skills, but the very logic of their society. The house stood as a quiet fortress of Ma'at, anchoring the family against the chaos outside. Here, women managed grain stores and legal contracts, turning domestic labor into economic power. The shrine held spiritual defenses, while walls ensured physical preservation. This synthesis of law, faith, and survival created a stable microcosm where identity endured beyond the fragile body. Within this architectural container, life and death intertwined seamlessly. The home was not merely a shelter, but a vessel for identity, securing the family's continuity against the finality of decay. Spiritual shrines offered protection during life, while the tomb promised insurance for the journey ahead. By preserving legal records and physical remains in one place, families created an unbreakable link between their present existence and their eternal future. Chapter 6: The Rhythm of Faith, Temple Economics, and Divine Reciprocity. Before the sun crested the eastern hills, the high priest of Amun entered the inner sanctum. The air was thick with Kaifi incense and the heavy silence of stone. His hands, steady with practice, applied kohl to the god's statue eyes, a daily act of sight for the invisible deity. He dressed the gold-laden figure in linen, whispering hymns that summoned the sun god back from the night. This was not abstract worship. It was essential maintenance. The temple relied on this meticulous labor. Every brushstroke, every chant, was a brick in the wall between humanity and the divine. Without these private acts of care, the god would fade. The system worked because ordinary people believed their tiny contributions fed this mighty household. Step beyond the sanctuary's sanctum into the clamorous administrative wing, where the divine economy is tallied with ruthless precision. Here, scribes with ink-stained fingers record vast mountains of grain, heavy sacks of linen, and thousands of livestock heads in thick leather-bound ledgers. Each entry transforms abstract piety into tangible capital, proving that every humble prayer adds weight to the temple's coffers. This bureaucratic machinery employs hundreds of artisans, bakers, and brewers, turning simple devotion into a massive industrial engine that feeds the city and rivals the king's own treasury in sheer logistical power. Beyond the grand stone temples lay a denser network of shrines, woven into the very fabric of village life. These were not places of state ritual, but intimate corners for daily survival. A peasant family would approach a small niche in the mud brick wall, leaving behind a simple faience figure of Bes to ward off evil spirits and a tiny stele carved with their names. Here, protection was personal, immediate, and entirely accessible to those who could not enter the Holy of Holies. The Obit festival transformed Thebes into a river of gold and incense. As the sacred bark carrying Amun's statue floated down the Nile, rigid social hierarchies dissolved in the humid heat. Commoners surged forward, pressing against bronze statues to touch the hem of divinity. Strangers danced together in chaotic unison. For one night, the distance between peasant and pharaoh vanished into the rhythmic beat of drums and the collective breath of a people united by awe. Behind the heavy stone walls, far from the public gaze, a different kind of power thrived in the cool shadows of the inner sanctum's adjacent quarters. Here, the god's wife of Amun, accompanied by her circle of female priestesses, commanded the flow of immense temple wealth. They meticulously distributed goods and audited the offerings that fed the city, while simultaneously inspecting every sacred space for ritual purity. By managing the divine garments and overseeing the vast economic engine of the cult, these women held a unique agency, wielding significant political and financial influence that far exceeded the limited roles available to most women in ordinary society. Their control over the temple's resources ensured the divine presence was maintained, turning individual devotion into collective power. In the bustling grain markets of ancient Egypt, commerce was never merely a transaction of goods and silver. It was a sacred ritual bound by Ma'at. When a merchant negotiated the price of wheat or barley, he did not simply weigh scales or count coins. He stood before the offering table of Thoth, invoking the goddess of truth to witness his words. His contract included an oath to Ma'at, effectively making cosmic order a co-signer of the deal. This was not abstract theology, but practical law. If he cheated, he risked not just legal penalties, but divine retribution that would haunt his lineage. The abstract ideal became tangible, ensuring fairness in trade and stability for the family who relied on that daily bread. That humble grain sack, carried through the dusty streets by a devoted family, does not simply vanish into the temple's shadows. Instead, it arrives as a verified entry in the grand ledger, a single thread woven into the vast tapestry of divine sustenance. Each private offering, small and personal, accumulates to fuel the public machinery of the state. The festival's communal joy strengthens the resolve to give, creating an unbreakable cycle where domestic piety supports the cosmic order, and that order, in turn, protects the home. What begins as a quiet act of faith becomes the very engine of societal stability, proving that the sacred is built upon countless ordinary moments of generosity. In the quiet of their courtyard, the family completes their evening prayers. They are no longer separate from the divine machinery that powers Ma'at. The female priestess, the merchant's fairness, and the temple's vast infrastructure all converge here. Their private rituals sustain the public order, just as that order sustains them. This seamless integration ensures protection and continuity, weaving ordinary life into the eternal cosmic rhythm. Chapter 7. The Weight of Ma'at, Legal Disputes and Social Contracts in Daily Life. In the dusty quiet of Deir el-Medina, the scribe Pebus picked up his chisel and scratched a complaint onto a broken potsherd. This ostracum recorded a mason's plea for stolen grain rations, not as an abstract appeal to heaven, but as a concrete entry in the Kenbet court archive. Each stroke of stone cemented a legal right, turning personal grievance into administrative fact. The law here was not a distant divine concept, but a tangible tool for survival, stabilizing daily life through ink, stone, and the careful preservation of human justice. Hentia did not merely endure the discord of her marriage, she activated the legal machinery designed for such moments. Under the strictures of her marriage contract, she invoked the Household Allowance Clause, a provision that recognized women as economic agents rather than passive dependents. This legal instrument allowed her to retain control over her personal property, even when the marital bond fractured, demonstrating how Egyptian law granted specific autonomy. Unlike the broad patriarchal norms governing public life, these private frameworks operated with surprising flexibility, allowing women like Hentia to leverage contractual terms for survival. The seal on her contract was not just ink. It was a shield against destitution, proving that justice in daily life often depended on the precise wording of an agreement and the witnesses who upheld it. 6 distinct seals pressed into damp papyrus anchored a land transfer between neighbors. These wax imprints served as immutable proof, substituting for police force with communal trust. The same witness tradition that validated court records also ensured market fairness, transforming personal agreement into public stability and confirming that justice was a practical human achievement. The creditor's hand hovered over the plow, fingers tightening around the wood of the shaft. The air in the barn was thick with dust and desperation. This man had nothing left to give but his ability to work. In ancient Egypt, total ruin was not a legal option. The state intervened here, drawing a hard line between debt and starvation. You could take the harvest, but never the seed. You could claim the surplus, but never the livelihood. To strip a farmer of his tools was to erase his future, and by extension yours. So the ledger was closed on metal and opened on flesh. The plough remained in the earth, anchored to the soil he owned. In exchange, his days belonged to the estate for 3 months. He would labor until the debt was paid back, not with coins that did not exist, but with sweat under the sun. This was the practical architecture of justice, preventing collapse by preserving capacity. The law ensured he survived to pay, protecting society from a class of desperate, stateless men who had no stake in its peace. The merchant's deceit is immediate and undeniable. His falsified weight, designed to cheat buyers in the bustling market, violates the core principle of Marat. This is not merely a transaction dispute, but a profound moral failure that destabilizes social trust. Witnesses step forward without hesitation, citing legal precedents established in court archives. The community enforces this truth through immediate sanctions, stripping him of his standing. Thus, cosmic order is maintained through human action, ensuring market fairness and societal stability. The judge's gavel fell with heavy finality, sealing the merchant's fate not by moral right, but by the victim standing in society. For a noble, exile was mercy. For a commoner, it was ruin. This legal calculus ensured that order remained intact, proving that justice was less about fairness and more about maintaining the rigid social structure that kept the entire civilization from descending into chaos. The gavel struck the wooden bench, echoing through the hall as Phoebus was sentenced to pay the merchant's debt, while Hentia's reputation settled like dust after a storm. This ruling did more than resolve a dispute. It stitched individual actions back into the fabric of Ma'at. Each contract signed and each judgment enforced became a thread in the social web. The state did not merely punish, it curated stability. By defining where every person stood, the law transformed chaos into order, ensuring that justice was not an abstract ideal, but a tangible, lived reality for everyone. Cosmic order did not sustain itself through ritual alone. It relied on the daily enforcement of law by ordinary people. Stability was a human construct, maintained through rigorous adherence to legal codes and contracts. Justice was a practical achievement carried by social standing, proving that individual acts formed the foundation of collective stability. Chapter 8. The Grain and the Gold. Trade, Taxation, and Economic Exchange. The scribe's stylus scratches across the broken pottery shard, a stark contrast to the soft golden husks of emmer wheat resting nearby in the sun-drenched courtyard. With deliberate, practiced strokes, he inscribes the harvest quota, 20 full measures of grain, and 3 arduous days of labor owed by this peasant family to the state granary. This inscription is not merely a record, it is an immediate claim on their survival, transforming the sweat of the field into cold, unyielding debt before the baskets are even carried away. The weight of the future begins now, measured in grain and bound by ink. The heavy sacks of emmer weighed down on weary shoulders as peasants hauled their assessed grain toward the local state granary. The air smelled of dust and dry husks, a stark contrast to the cool stone walls awaiting them. Inside, overseers with sharp eyes verified every bushel, checking for quality before sealing the harvest into cold storage. This was not merely a transaction, it was a stripping of immediate possession. While the farmer walked away with empty hands and a fading memory of his labor, the state secured its famine reserves and temple tithes. The grain, once a symbol of potential survival, now became abstract capital, locked away in the shadows of administrative hierarchy while the noble feasted nearby. At the local set market, the potter laid his freshly fired jars on the stone counter. With no coins in circulation, trade relied on copper rings and precise weights. The merchant balanced a ring against the standard stone, ensuring fairness for every loaf of bread exchanged. This rigid scale dictated survival, proving that economic stability rested not on wealth, but on the accurate measurement of daily necessities. The merchant stood by the bustling dock, watching Nile barges unload papyrus and linen. He calculated potential profits against the ever-present risk of robbery or seasonal delays that threatened his capital. As a middleman bridging regional economies, he introduced volatility to trade between Upper and Lower Egypt. His success depended on precise calculations, linking individual risk directly to the steward's ability to maintain order through steady revenue streams. The laborer's day ends with a dense slab of emmer bread and a cup of thick fermented beer. It is food that fills the belly but offers little variety or luxury. Meanwhile, in the shaded courts of the elite, the air carries the scent of roasted gazelle and sweet figs drizzled in imported olive oil. This stark contrast defines their worlds. The state takes the grain to build its power, leaving the worker with mere survival, while the noble's table reflects a hierarchy enforced by abundance and privilege. In the shadow of a poor harvest, copper weights grew heavier for those who had little. The laborer returned with his usual wage, but the scales demanded more metal for the same loaf of bread. His savings, once a buffer against famine, now bought less. While prices danced on the edge of scarcity, the state's demand remained fixed in grain. He stood on the market stone, realizing that his currency had lost its voice, while the treasury's authority echoed louder than ever. The steward's ink dip marks another day of balance. Grain silos swell with the kingdom's harvest, while copper coins clink in heavy purses. He watches the scales tip, weighing merchant profits against peasant rations. To him, this is not greed, but ma'at made tangible. Cosmic order is sustained not by prayers alone, but by these cold, hard totals. The state remains constant. Prices may shift with the winds of trade, yet authority endures in every bushel collected and every ledger closed at dusk. As the sun dipped below the western horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty worksite, the laborer sat heavily on a stone block. He unclasped his leather pouch and spilled its contents onto his palm, a few heavy copper rings and scattered silver coins. The value of the metal fluctuated with every rumor from the capital, but it meant nothing to the grain tax collector waiting at the granary gates. Those keys were iron, fixed by decree, unyielding as Ma'at itself. While nobles locked their storehouses against the night, securing their wealth in silence, the worker's entire survival hinged on this precarious balance. His social standing was not defined by birth or blood, but by how closely his daily tally matched the state's demand. In this economy, cosmic order was measured in bushels, and leverage belonged to those who held the keys. Chapter 9. The Threshold of Eternity. Mortuary Practices and the Social Contract of Death. To the north, massive tombs were carved deep into solid limestone, designed to defy time itself with enduring stone walls. Yet just miles away, commoners were buried in shallow pits dug hastily into loose desert sand. These graves were destined to collapse, their markers erased by the first wind or rain, leaving no physical trace behind. But this fragility of earth did not mean a lack of care. Both the noble in his rock-cut chamber and the peasant in his fleeting pit shared the same desperate drive, an undeniable human need to assert presence against the void, proving they once lived with concrete permanence. While the pharaoh rested in stone mountains, ordinary people secured their passage through a different kind of wealth. They bought spiritual insurance on earth. This democratization meant that access to the afterlife was no longer a royal monopoly, but a commodity available to those who could afford it. Amulets like heart scarabs and faience ushabtis served as portable guarantees for eternity, offering the middle class a tangible connection to the gods without needing vast tombs or endless labor. For the average Egyptian family, eternity was not a gift from the gods, but a long-term financial project. Over years of frugal saving, they hoarded grain to trade for copper tools and linen cloth. This slow accumulation of wealth transformed death from a sudden event into a heavy economic burden, requiring communal sacrifice just to buy the materials needed for basic mummification. The tomb was not merely a resting place, but an active workplace for the deceased Ka. Living descendants maintained this vital connection by regularly visiting family shrines to present fresh loaves of bread, cool pitchers of beer, and fragrant flowers. This routine was not simple mourning. It was a strict economic and spiritual contract. The living provided sustenance, ensuring the ancestor remained powerful enough to protect the household from chaos. In return, the dead blessed the farmers with good harvests and health. Death did not sever these ties, it formalized them into a permanent, reciprocal dependency that anchored the entire community. The grand monuments of stone were reserved for kings, but ordinary Egyptians found a different kind of permanence. They bought amulets and practiced rituals, viewing these as spiritual insurance policies for the journey ahead. Yet, this protection was not guaranteed by gold or lineage alone. It relied entirely on the moral logic of Ma'at. To live in accordance with truth and justice was to align oneself with the cosmic order. This alignment became the true foundation for resurrection, allowing the common person to secure their place in the afterlife through ethical conduct rather than royal blood. While royal tombs boasted towering statues of eternal stone, ordinary Egyptians relied on something far more fragile yet deeply personal, the papyrus list. Archaeologists have uncovered these delicate documents, written in hurried ink, detailing exactly which sandals, jars of honey, and woolen tunics were buried with their owners. These mundane inventories reveal a profound truth. Identity was not carved for kings, but packed for the journey, a quiet assertion that even in death, the specific comforts of daily life remained the anchor of the soul. Grief was never a solitary burden in ancient societies. It became a collective project of survival. Families pooled their meager resources, weaving textiles and crafting pottery, not merely as gifts for the dead, but as tangible proof of their enduring unity. The shared pressure of mortuary costs forced kin closer together. In this rigorous exchange of labor and goods, the community found its strength. Mourning rituals transformed individual loss into a reinforcement of social bonds, ensuring that while bodies decayed, the family structure remained unbroken against the harsh realities of daily existence. The stone endures, but it is cold and silent, a static monument to power that eventually crumbles under time's relentless weight. True permanence was never found in chiseled rock, but in the quiet daily acts of ordinary Egyptians caring for one another. The real legacy was social continuity, the unbroken chain of love and duty passed from parent to child, ensuring that memory survived long after the monuments themselves had turned to dust. Chapter 10. The soldier's shield and the merchant's scales, protection, trade, and the expansion of horizons. Nefer poked at his stale flatbread, the dry crust cracking under his calloused thumb. Beside it sat a clay jar of sour beer, thick and warm from the humid garrison air. He had traded half his daily ration for a new wooden beer, mud bricks crumbling faster than his patience under the relentless sun. His bronze-tipped spear rested against the wall, its point worn thin from parrying Nubian skirmishers who struck with desperate speed. But the metal was less concerning than the creeping heat in his own wrist. A faint rash bloomed there, a silent fever unknown to Thebes. In the borderlands, danger did not always roar. Sometimes it waited quietly in the blood. Keti balanced the cedar logs with copper rings, their clink marking the rhythm of exchange. He watched the scribe's reed scratch across papyrus, a cold, legalizing sound that turned his labor into data. The weight of the trade was not just in the wood, but in the ink. This paper trail was his shield against chaos. It defined his identity in a foreign land where order was not kept by spears alone, but by the precise, unyielding geometry of scales and contracts. Happy adjusted his fine linen wrap, distinct from the coarse cotton worn by laborers, as he clutched the sealed royal decree against his chest. This thin cylinder of papyrus held the king's will, granting him temporary authority over provincial governors. Yet Hapi knew his power was entirely derivative. Unlike Nefer the soldier, whose security was guaranteed by the state's iron spear, Hapi's status was fragile. He served as a vital link between court and province, but his position depended on proximity to power, not personal strength. One misstep in interpretation could strip him of protection, leaving him exposed to the very provincial elites he sought to manage. His world was one of precise words and precarious standing. On the burning overland tracks, laborers hauled heavy loads through blistering heat, their waterskins nearly empty. Unlike the protected river routes, they faced raw physical toll and constant bandit threats, highlighting the severe danger of independent trade versus state security. State miners returned with heavy gold, filling royal coffers with secure profit. Private merchants risked death for rare ivory and spices. The crown guaranteed stability through land grants, while traders faced unpredictable dangers. This economic divide defined social status. One relied on institutional strength, the other on personal survival, amidst the perilous trade routes that connected distant lands to the heart of the kingdom's power. For Nefer, discharge meant more than just leaving the barracks. He received a land grant from the pharaoh, a tangible piece of the Nile's fertile soil that guaranteed his family's survival for generations. This security was not given to everyone. Consider Keti the merchant. While Nefer held his estate in perpetuity, Keti walked a narrower line. His wealth existed only so long as the state tolerated his trade routes and taxed them fairly. One shift in regulation, or one act of royal disfavor, could strip him of everything. The soldier owned his future, the merchant merely rented it from the crown. The soldiers and merchants returning from distant lands brought more than goods, they brought gods. Baal, the storm deity of the Canaanite coast, found a new altar in the dust of Thebes. Astarte, goddess of love and war, was welcomed into Egyptian temples alongside her traditional counterparts. This was not merely commerce, it was a slow invasion of the spirit. For generations, isolation had protected Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept chaos at bay. Now, foreign rituals seeped into the daily rhythm of life. The tension was palpable. Traditionalists watched with wary eyes as the divine landscape shifted, questioning whether these new deities strengthened or threatened the fragile balance of their world. Faith became a battlefield. Divine harmony alone cannot sustain a civilization. Order requires human hands to enforce it. Soldiers guard borders, not just with spears, but by embodying the state's authority to punish disorder. Merchants balance scales, their precise weights mirroring the legal contracts that define identity and status in daily life. This intricate web of obligations between private risk and public duty creates the stable foundation upon which society rests, proving that stability relies on human enforcement through law, not just prayer. Chapter 11. The weight of rations, food, labor, and the bread of life. In the quiet chill of the temple granary, the harvest's value is not felt in joy but in weight. Scribes with steady hands lift heavy sacks of emmer wheat and barley, pouring them into standardized baskets until the grain reaches the exact line. Each scoop is counted on an ostracon, turning raw agricultural bounty into precise administrative currency. This is how the state feeds the workforce, not through generosity, but through measured obligation. The physical heft of the grain dictates social standing, linking every calorie to a recorded debt owed to the gods and the crown alike. Beyond the granary walls, the air grew thick with the heat of large brick ovens and the sharp tang of fermenting beer. State-employed bakers and brewers operated here as critical civil servants, transforming measured sacks of coarse grain into daily rations. It was an industrial process where milling grit into dough and boiling mash fed the work crew's capacity to build monuments. Peasant teeth bore the scars of stone-ground grit, worn smooth by centuries of coarse bread. For laborers, this was the biological cost of survival, a daily erosion that nobles avoided through sifting. They chose safety in barley beer instead, gaining calories without the physical toll. This division defined their health, turning diet into an unbreachable class barrier. The state didn't just produce beer for pleasure, it was a calculated survival mechanism. While ordinary water from stagnant pools carried deadly pathogens, the fermentation process sanitized it completely. This thick, nutrient-dense liquid provided essential calories and hydration without the illness risk of drinking raw river water. For laborers enduring heavy stonework, it was their most critical nutritional buffer. In this ancient economy, bread was not just sustenance, it was currency itself. A single loaf held specific weight in social exchange, determining the worth of labor and goods alike. Brickmakers earned their daily wages measured in loaves, while oil and clay carried values directly tied to these caloric units. This system anchored wealth in physical survival, making food the primary metric for all transactions, from humble wages to grand purchases. State engineers designed massive mud brick granaries with thick walls to keep grain cool and dry, preventing spoilage during the humid Nile floods. Sealed clay pots stored beer and water, creating a reliable buffer against seasonal shortages. This logistical infrastructure ensured that every worker received their daily ration, turning agricultural surplus into a steady stream of calories that powered the monuments. When priests laid out fresh loaves and clay jugs of beer for the deities, they were not merely performing a symbolic gesture. This car food was consumed in spirit, transferring vital energy that sustained the soul's identity beyond death. Thus, every loaf baked by laborers became a religious act, anchoring the social order to divine needs while validating their daily survival through sacred ritual. The granary walls held firm, ensuring bread and beer flowed reliably to every worker. This steady caloric exchange anchored the hierarchy in physical necessity. People accepted this dependency not just for survival, but as a sacred ritual. The state fed the body, the people fed the order. Survival was the contract written in grain. Chapter 12. The Architecture of Death. Preparing for the car in ordinary homes. In Thebes, a middle-class merchant sat by his oil lamp, agonizing over which specific spells to copy onto a narrow papyrus scroll. For him, the Book of the Dead was not an elite monopoly, but a practical financial transaction. He weighed the cost of protection against drowning or starvation, customizing his portable afterlife insurance with the same careful calculation he applied to his daily trade, ensuring his family's security extended beyond the grave through affordable spiritual preparation rather than grand architectural displays. In the dusty alleys of the working-class quarter, the air hummed with the rhythmic scraping of wooden paddles against wet clay. Here, a potter shaped dozens of crude, unglazed shabti figures, his hands moving with practiced efficiency to create proxy workers for the afterlife. These were not the gilded, intricately detailed statuettes reserved for kings and high nobles, but humble, mass-produced servants intended to toil in the field of reeds. Every copper coin saved by the family was dedicated to buying these essential figures, ensuring their loved one would not labor alone in the next world, a stark contrast to the empty graves of those too poor to afford even this minimal insurance. In the cramped quarters of the urban compound, families carved small niches into the mud brick walls. Here, a simple clay table held daily offerings for the car, the spirit of deceased ancestors. This domestic shrine brought the sacred realm directly into the home, allowing ordinary Egyptians to interact with the dead without leaving their living space or traveling to a distant tomb. In the cramped tenement, professional embalmers were an impossible luxury. Instead, the neighbors pooled their resources to wash and wrap the deceased. They used natron from a community pot and linen strips gathered by hand. This communal effort ensured ritual purity and dignity for the poor, proving that spiritual validity rested on collective care rather than expensive services. While the wealthy packed their tombs with gold and vast estates of shabti servants to work for them in the afterlife, ordinary laborers took a different path. With little money for grand rituals, they curated a small personal museum of their own lives. A chisel, a simple amulet for protection, and a child's clay toy became the anchors of identity. These tangible objects were not just belongings, they were final assertions of self-worth, proving that even in death, they remained distinct individuals rather than faceless masses. The scribe's reed pen scratched against the papyrus, drafting a will that was less about inheritance and more about survival after death. With steady precision, he allocated specific measures of grain and copper coins to ensure burial rights would be paid for upon passing. This legal safeguard prevented the family from facing destitution due to funeral costs, transforming financial planning into a necessary spiritual duty against post-mortem poverty. In a modest home, a mother tallies the family ledger with heavy focus. The cost of fine linen for her husband's wrapping and pure natron for purification demands sacrifice. She marks luxury goods and extra rations as expenses to be cut. This financial strain is non-negotiable. Spiritual permanence outweighs earthly comfort. The household budget shrinks, but the preparation for death remains complete. Ritual purity dictates their survival. Every copper coin counts toward this essential transaction. The merchant's spells, the potter's clay figures, and the sealed legal will were not isolated acts of piety, but a unified societal strategy. Across all strata, Egyptians transformed daily economic survival into spiritual insurance, linking wealth to permanence. This awareness of death united them in a shared endeavor, shifting focus from static monuments to dynamic human preparation for the afterlife. Chapter 13. The Scribe's Ledger, Bureaucracy as Daily Survival. In the quiet archive, a senior scribe mixes soot with gum arabic, creating the black ink that becomes the true currency of survival. Beside him, an assistant dampens papyrus scrolls for the day's ledgers. The air hangs thick with cedar oil and linen dust, grounding the scene in tangible labor. As the brush touches paper, it is not art being created, but a claim on state grain. Every stroke defines authority, turning wet paste into social order. This physical act of writing is where bureaucratic power truly lives, linking the humble preparation of materials directly to the control of the nation's caloric resources and establishing the hierarchy that governs daily life. Outside the heavy clay walls of the archive, the air was thick with dust and the scent of dry stalks. Grain inspectors stood shoulder to shoulder with farmers, using standardized wooden cubes to measure every sack of harvested wheat. It was a precise, unyielding process where volume dictated value. One scribe sat nearby on a low stool, scratching calculations onto jagged shards of pottery called ostraca. He worked quickly, his style hurried but accurate, capturing the raw numbers before they were transferred to the official papyrus records. This wasn't just accounting, it was the birth of hierarchy. The number he wrote determined everything. For instance, a mere discrepancy in one jar's yield meant exactly 2 fewer liters of beer for the afternoon work crew. That small gap in measurement rippled through their day, altering morale, pace, and trust. The physical act of measuring grain became the foundation of social order, turning abstract harvests into concrete reality. The scribe dipped his reed pen into the black ink. With steady hands, he transferred the day's verified measurements from the broken clay shards to the smooth white surface of the master papyrus scroll. Bread loaves, beer jars, and linen strips were listed in dry, repetitive columns. Each entry quantified a human life in caloric units. This document was the silent bridge between the state's immense wealth and the laborer's empty stomach. He stood before the clerk, expecting barley, but found silence instead. His name was absent from the clay tablet, leaving him invisible to the gods of statecraft. The scribe, robed in white linen and exempt from field labor, pointed to the dry reed pen. Without ink binding him to the ledger, he held no place in the economy, existing only as a ghost among the living workers. Inside the dim scribe's quarters, a single oil lamp flickers, casting long shadows against the mud brick walls. The air is thick with dust and the sharp scent of damp clay. Before him lies a tablet, its surface still soft enough to yield to the pressure of his reed stylus. His hand hovers, trembling slightly above the wet surface. One slip, one misjudged wedge, could mean dismissal or worse. For in this kingdom, accuracy is not just preferred, it is enforced with the lash. The weight of state bureaucracy rests entirely on his fingertips. The farmer stepped forward, clutching the fragile papyrus scroll with both hands, his knuckles white against the dry surface. He placed it on the scribe's desk, careful not to crease the edge of the agreement. The official dipped his reed pen into the black ink, hesitated only for a moment, then pressed the heavy seal firmly onto the paper. That wet imprint of authority transformed simple straw fibers into an unbreakable shield against the powerful neighbors who had long coveted his land. To the ancient scribe, the archive was never a quiet storage room for dusty records. It was a living loom. Here, every clay tablet and inked scroll functioned like a thread of obligation. When a contract was written, the state wove that individual into a specific social role. You were no longer just a person. You were a debt holder, a worker, or a landowner, defined entirely by your position in this bureaucratic web. Stability depended on every thread holding tight. The final scroll was sealed with wet clay, pressing a cylinder of reed into the surface. That simple physical act did more than record data. It codified who owned the grain, who owed the labor, and who stood where in the rigid hierarchy. The scribe's ink became the invisible scaffolding of society. Without this bureaucratic precision, the state could not distribute resources or enforce order. Literacy was the tool that anchored human identity to the land, making abstract power tangible through lists, ledgers, and the weight of obligation. Chapter 14. The Scribes of the Nile, the ink that held the state together. The scribe's fingers were permanently stained black and red. This ink was no mere pigment, but a tangible force. Through reed brushes and papyrus scrolls, administrative power took physical form. Rough calculations scratched on ostraca underpinned the meticulous order of daily life, grounding bureaucracy in manual labor rather than abstract thought alone. Inside the sun-baked granary, overseers stood with measuring cups marked in kapat, carefully calculating every grain of barley destined for the workforce. They tallied the livestock nearby, ensuring the state's wealth was accurately recorded before issuing standardized ration tickets. These paper vouchers became the immediate currency for laborers, transforming abstract tax assessments into the bread and broth that sustained their physical survival each day. The scribes left their stone walls behind, carrying reed styluses and rolls of damp papyrus into the muddy fields beyond the capital. They did not come with armies, but with accounts. Walking the ridges of the harvest, they measured the stalks against the high watermarks on the Nile banks. A record was born in the mud, calculating who owed grain to the state. This ink did more than store numbers. It pulled resources from the village granaries into the royal storehouses, binding every farmer to the silent ledger of the crown. Inscribing a land deed or marriage dowry was more than administration. It was an act of survival. The ink became a shield, holding property against the arbitrary hunger of elites. Where grain flowed from a scribe's reed to fill royal storehouses as a coercive tax, the same written record simultaneously anchored a family's legal standing, turning fleeting promises into immutable protections that kept chaos at bay for generations. In the quiet archives, scribes didn't just write, they enforced order. Ink became a force, shaping society through meticulous records kept in wooden cabinets. Contracts evolved from private deals into public moral duties, while strict oversight bound individuals to institutional risk, proving that accuracy was a managed output of rigid discipline. Scribes escaped the mud of corvée labor, earning respect through the ink they spilled. Yet their privilege was fragile. A tightrope walked above a pit of retribution. A single misstep in record-keeping meant the rod, not the plough. Their status depended entirely on precision under constant pressure. With every stroke of the reed pen, ink bled into papyrus, transforming a mere transaction into a sacred bond. This was no simple record-keeping. It was the weight of the state pressing down on ordinary lives. The scribe's entry became law, altering legal standing and moral duty for everyone involved. In this web of obligations, paper held the true power, binding farmer to lord, debtor to creditor, in a delicate, unbreakable chain of societal interdependence. This is the quiet power of ink. It bound the farmer's field and the merchant's debt into a single, unbreakable web. The scribe's steady hand did not just record history, it enforced it. One accurate line secured food for a family and order for the state. In this fragile balance of trust and verification, civilization stood on the edge of a reed pen. Chapter 15, The Weight of the Feather, the democratization of moral accountability. Under the relentless Theban sun, Kaba's fingers traced the bronze weights at his stall. A tiny notch on one scale betrayed a deception he could have easily hidden from the absent inspector. His hand hovered. Then, his thumb brushed the Ma'at amulet against his chest, a silent reminder that truth was not law, but cosmic balance. He silently swapped the flawed weight for an accurate one, ensuring every thread of wool measured perfectly. The customer left satisfied. From a nearby cart, an older vendor gave a slow, respectful nod. Honesty was their quiet currency. In the quiet heart of Deir el-Medina, reputation was not merely a social commodity, but a spiritual currency. Nefer and Toy stood within the modest walls of a scribe's home, examining an ostraka shard with grim satisfaction. The complaint was not about stolen grain or disputed boundaries, but about false rumors regarding fidelity. Here, gossip functioned as immediate enforcement against Isfet, weaving personal shame directly into the fabric of divine judgment. Every whispered word served as a reminder that earthly stigma was but a precursor to cosmic accountability, binding the community together through shared moral vigilance and fear. In quiet homes across the Nile, the elite ritual of judgment seeped into daily life. Fathers taught sons the negative confessions, not as distant theology, but as a practical moral checklist for ordinary people. Did you steal bread? Did you lie to your mother? These repeated affirmations democratized cosmic justice, turning family ethics into a spiritual inventory that ensured the heart remained light before the scales of eternity. In a cramped local shrine, Merit placed a clay figurine and a lock of hair on the altar. She did not pray for wealth or power. Instead, she offered silent thanksgiving for returning a lost silver ring. Her neighbor watched, understanding this as a public acknowledgement that piety was about recognizing one's place in cosmic order, not buying divine favor. When Isis discovered her husband's infidelity, she did not rush for legal divorce, which was rare and difficult in their society. Instead, she sought counsel from an elder woman who explained that such betrayal weighed heavily on the heart in the next life. Aware of this spiritual burden, he eventually confessed to the family council, not out of fear of punishment, but to lighten his moral load before the weighing ceremony. Young Kemi argued fiercely with his aging father, demanding more rest after long days at the merchant's stall. He failed to see that this domestic rebellion was a cosmic misstep. His master intervened, citing ancient texts that labeled disrespect toward parents as a grave sin against Ma'at. The warning struck Kemi deeply, revealing that every interaction, even within the home, was being weighed in the scales of eternity. Realizing his error, he sought forgiveness, finding peace in aligning his household harmony with the universal order. Sethi held the heavy sack of grain, his fingers tracing the rough burlap while drought baked the fields. The merchant's voice in his head whispered of profit, of hoarding every kernel for tomorrow's high prices. But greed felt like a stone in his chest, heavy and wrong. With a sigh, he walked to his neighbor's dusty door. "I will lend you seed," Sethi said, watching the man's eyes widen in disbelief. This was not charity, it was balance. To keep the world from slipping into chaos, one had to give, even when every instinct screamed to hold tight. The weight lifted, replaced by the quiet hum of Ma'at. The stars wheel overhead, indifferent to human toil yet deeply concerned with cosmic balance. Kaaba and Hori watched them from separate corners of the dark, understanding that their nightly reflections were not mere melancholy but vital preparation. In this ancient worldview, honesty was a spiritual currency, as tangible as gold. Every act of Ma'at, the truth spoken in the market, the respect shown to elders, the grain kept for the hungry, added weight to the soul's journey. Greed dissolved under this light, revealed as a dangerous emptiness. The scales of judgment awaited, but they weighed actions, not wealth. Life was the rehearsal, death was the performance. Ethical integrity became the only armor against chaos, ensuring that when the final verdict came, the heart would be light, and the soul eternal. Chapter 16, The Scribes of Marat, the Ink That Bound Society. The minor noble held the ledger with deliberate care, his eyes tracing the dense columns of cuneiform. But it was not the numbers that commanded his attention. It was the physical evidence on his manager's hands. Ink stained the fingertips, a permanent badge of literacy. In this world, reading was more than an intellectual pursuit. It was armor. To read a contract meant to understand one's rights. It offered a tangible shield against arbitrary taxation and exploitation. The ink confirmed he knew the law, turning knowledge into a formidable status distinction. His manager stood ready, bound by written terms that even the governor could not easily overturn. This was protection made visible. In the quiet corners of ancient villages, pottery shards were far more than broken dinner plates. They served as the everyday notebooks for ordinary people. Farmers used these ostraca to jot down draft contracts, record livestock counts, and list grocery purchases. These casual scribbles reveal the mundane heart of bureaucracy. Writing was not just for kings. It bound daily existence together through simple, repeated acts of tracking life's smallest details. The scribe dipped his reed brush into the inkwell, eyes fixed on the Nilometer's water level. This was no divine miracle to him, but raw data. He calculated the inundation depth against last year's harvest records, determining exactly how much grain each village owed the pharaoh. Farmers heard rumors of high water and felt a strange relief. Low water brought panic. Here, in the quiet scriptorium, the Nile's flood was not a blessing or curse. It was merely an equation. And for the first time, before a single stalk of wheat turned gold, the economic fate of thousands was sealed on parchment. The scribe's dry calculation became their concrete reality. Armed with mastered arithmetic, the lower clerk turned numbers into leverage. He calculated profit margins with sharp precision, negotiating better prices for his shop, while minor officials gained legal standing. This administrative literacy offered a rare ladder of social mobility, allowing scribes to ascend from humble roles into positions of tangible economic power and respect. At the bustling work site of Deir el-Medina, a village scribe sat hunched over a limestone flake, his fingers permanently stained with black ink and red ochre. With precise practice strokes, he tallied the daily labor hours of each artisan, turning abstract macrometrics of survival into concrete micro-records of individual effort. Every scratch on this ostraca served as an invisible thread, linking the worker's physical toil directly to the state's provision of essential ration tickets. Without this meticulous accounting, the fragile bridge between human endurance and material existence would collapse, leaving laborers without the bread that kept their families alive and their identities valid within the rigid architecture of Egyptian bureaucracy. In the dusty heart of the village, a heated dispute over a stolen goat threatened to fracture the community's fragile peace. The neighbors turned, not to the elder's word, but to the young scribe who held a stamped papyrus seal. This was no longer just paper. It was ironclad proof that could not be denied by memory or mood. As the seal clicked shut with finality, the oral agreements of old faded away. The written word had become the new glue holding society together, proving that, in this new age, trust was no longer found in a handshake, but in a mark. To the ancient mind, writing was not merely a record of grain or labor, it was a tangible shield against chaos. Scribes wove disparate threads, farmers' anxiety, clerks' negotiation, workers' ration into a single administrative narrative. This bureaucracy became the nervous system of the state, binding economic reality to legal authority and ensuring Ma'at endured through the power of the written word. We must understand that cosmic harmony was not merely a spiritual ideal whispered in temples, but a rigorous legal reality enforced by state authority. Writing served as the ultimate armor for every citizen, protecting their rights through contracts and property records. This administrative layer did more than manage grain. It defined who you were before life's end. Bureaucracy became the societal glue, binding individual identity to Ma'at, ensuring that order prevailed not just in the heavens, but in the daily lives of ordinary people across the land. Chapter 17. The Archive of the Ordinary, legal agency and domestic property rights. In the village of Deir el-Media, the weaver Nebet stood before the notary with a stamped papyrus deed in hand. It was not a gift from a husband or father. The document clearly listed her independent purchase of arable land and a house, paid for entirely by her own textile earnings. Crucially, no male guardian signed as guarantor. This legal instrument proved she held tangible economic power, establishing a foundation of financial security that defied the common assumptions of female dependency in the ancient world. Nebet unrolled the marriage contract, its ink still fresh against the papyrus. It promised bread and beer every month, guaranteed regardless of Ahmez's income. A sharp clause protected her dowry if he failed or left her barren. This wasn't just social formality. It was binding economic insurance, a safeguard ensuring she kept what was hers. Ahmez cites Nebet's barrenness as grounds for a second marriage, but rather than facing social ruin, she exercises her legal right to separate. The contract is executed swiftly and fairly. Nebet claims all her premarital jewelry and exactly half the value of the tools they acquired together. This immediate division proves that divorce was not a stigma, but a dissolvable partnership where economic autonomy remained intact for both parties. Nebet stands no longer as a servant bound to one household, but as an independent economic agent with legal standing. As a widowed free woman, she possesses the rare right to negotiate her own terms in the labor market. She approaches a local merchant not as a dependent but as a master weaver seeking employment. The transaction is formalized through a fixed-term labor contract signed and witnessed. Crucially, Nebet retains full ownership of her loom and raw materials, assets that would have remained the property of her husband or his kin had she been less free. This legal clarity allows her to work for wages directly, distinguishing her status sharply from female slaves who lack the capacity to own property or enter binding financial agreements independently. Her hands are her own, and so is her livelihood. Kamud stood across from the merchant, the air thick with tension. He held up a papyrus scroll, his finger tracing the inked figures that proved he had already paid for the materials through labor credits. The merchant's eyes narrowed as he read the official record, realizing the debt was settled in full by the scribe's own hand. Without the contract, Kamud would have been forced into servitude or seized his tools to cover the alleged interest. This document was not merely paper. It was a shield against exploitation. It validated his worth as a writer and secured his economic independence in a society where words could bind even the most powerful traders. When men worked on state projects, wives became legal heads of household. Nebet signed tax receipts with sealed impressions. This was not a favor, but a function. She dealt directly with officials, proving that administration required documentation, not gender. The ink on the papyrus held the same weight as any man's signature. Nebet sets aside oral tradition. She drafts a will. Her loom goes to her daughter. So do gold earrings and garden land. Written words override distant male claims. This legal instrument ensures precise distribution. Ordinary citizens used it for tangible power. Women held economic agency through these directives. The system allowed individual control over assets. Nebet builds this security herself. Nebet's final legal maneuver secured her legacy for millennia. She bound the rents from her garden plot into a car food endowment. This created a permanent income stream, ensuring annual memorial feasts would always occur. By leveraging property rights so precisely, ordinary citizens like Nebet constructed independent economic security. Her will transformed simple agricultural land into an unbreakable chain of provision, binding her ancestors to perpetual care and proving that tangible wealth could defy the erosion of time. Chapter 18. The Archive of the Living, Scribes, Storage, and the Weight of Records. Before a single official record could touch the papyrus, the scribe first ground coal on his stone pallet. He smoothed the sheets with a shell and tested calculations on a clay sherd called an ostracum. This was not art, but administrative labor. The viscosity of the ink dictated the brush pressure. Only when these preliminary marks were verified did the true work begin, committing state data to the permanent archive of the living. In the dim light of the administrative hall, the senior scribe unrolled a thick papyrus scroll, its fibers brittle with age and dust. Before him lay a chaotic stack of grain yield reports from the village record keepers, each bearing the distinctive seal of local authority. With a steady hand, he pressed his stylus against the new sheet, demonstrating the sharp, precise, formal script reserved for elite documentation. The contrast was stark. Below him, junior scribes hurriedly copied crude hieroglyphs on cheaper mud tablets, their work rough and uneven compared to the master's elegant curves. This visible gap in technique reinforced the social order, proving that literacy was not just knowledge, but a privilege guarded by material choice and superior skill. The scribe dipped his reed brush into the inkwell, eyes scanning the worn papyrus scroll. He cross-referenced the current grain yields against historical Nile inundation records. The numbers shifted, converting abstract flood data into immediate tax obligations measured in standard Kepit units. This calculation transformed environmental history into tangible economic pressure for every farmer in the district. The storehouse overseer did not merely trust the ink on the papyrus. He walked the damp aisles of the mud brick granaries, his boots sinking into the dusty earth. His eyes scanned the towering mounds of golden grain, searching for the telltale signs of rot or the silken web of pestilence. He dipped his reed pen into the black ink and marked every discrepancy between the record and the reality. This physical verification was the only shield against the corrupt guards who might divert the state's wealth for their own pockets. The senior scribe smoothed the papyrus, its ink still fresh from the chancery's seal. He traced the lines granting him absolute exemption from corvée labor and heavy taxation. While field hands broke their backs under the sun, his literacy shielded him from such burdens. This privilege was not generosity but statecraft. The bureaucracy demanded immunities to ensure records survived the chaos of daily survival. In the shadow of the scribe's high stool, ordinary life found its voice in ink and papyrus. A farmer, weary from years of tax anxiety, placed a weathered contract on the desk. Beside him, an artisan with calloused hands offered his own deed. They were not seeking favor but proof. The scribe examined the wax seals, pressing them firmly into the clay. These markings became their shield, turning silent fears into undeniable legal security against powerful neighbors. Here, the scribe dipped his reed pen into dark ink, marking papyrus strips with precise ledgers of barley and emmer. These were not empty promises, but tangible ration tickets, physical vouchers that transformed abstract grain reserves into immediate subsistence for the laborers. Workers carried these slips to state depots, redeeming bureaucratic data for bread, turning cold storage into warm sustenance and economic leverage. The final stroke of ink dries upon the papyrus scroll, sealing another day's transactions. These individual contracts and ration tickets are not mere bureaucratic paperwork. They constitute the archive of the living. Through this accumulated weight of written records, individual identity and social standing are firmly established. It is a stable cosmic order, meticulously enforced by human hands and sustained by the enduring medium of truth, far exceeding the scope of divine whim. Chapter 19. The Scribe's Ledger. Bureaucracy as the living heart of Egypt. Before the ink dried on state mandates, the scribe's hands were stained with soot and gum arabic. He ground these materials meticulously, cutting papyrus reeds into precise sheets for official records. Using ostraca for rough calculations, he wielded reed brushes dipped in black and red inkwells. This specific, skilled manual labor granted him a rare social privilege, exemption from the corvée toil that crushed his unlettered neighbors. The scribe's hand, stained permanently with soot and wet ink, moved with deliberate speed across the papyrus scroll. He did not merely record history, he engineered economic reality for the coming year. Each stroke of the reed pen translated the chaotic generosity of the Nile flood into rigid, inescapable numbers. Grain yields were weighed in Deben units, livestock counted against household quotas. These abstract metrics became immediate financial burdens or unexpected relief for farmers long before the harvest was even gathered. The state did not just observe abundance, it captured it on paper, converting natural luck into fixed tax liabilities. For the commoner, the anxiety arrived not in the fields, but here, in the quiet calculation of a scribe who held their fate in measured strokes. Inside the towering mud-brick granaries, storehouse overseers waged a quiet war against entropy. They inspected for weevils and dampness, treating spoilage as a threat rivaling invasion. Their meticulous logs did not merely record grain entry, they tracked preservation status, ensuring that administrative accuracy physically prevented material loss. This bureaucratic precision kept the state's reserves intact, proving that every counted bushel was a shield against famine. For the ordinary farmer, a handshake was worthless against a powerful neighbor. Survival depended on ink. Scribes ground ochre and soot into durable pigment, filling papyrus with precise measurements of grain and land. These contracts were not merely administrative formalities, they were legal shields. By securing debts and property rights in permanent script, literacy empowered the vulnerable, transforming abstract state metrics into tangible protection against exploitation and ensuring individual autonomy within a rigid hierarchy. While the masses toiled under the weight of corvée labor and heavy taxation, scribes enjoyed a unique privilege, exemption from these burdens in exchange for their administrative service. This social stratification was defined by access to literacy and the state's record-keeping power, creating a permanent class boundary between those who managed resources and those subjected to them. The scribe's ink did more than record wealth. It built the state's very foundation. By securing the granaries, these officials ensured the life rafts of ration tickets remained valid, linking individual survival to the collective web of social obligation. Without these precise contracts, a farmer lost his legal identity and right to exist within the system. The hierarchical privilege sustaining this infrastructure was not merely about status, but about maintaining the concrete reality that turned abstract metrics into physical safety for ordinary people in ancient Egypt. Long before any divine judgment awaited them in the afterlife, a person's standing was defined here and now by the ink of a scribe. Every clay tablet sealing a loan or dividing land wove individual needs into a dense web of mutual obligation. This administrative class did not merely record history, they enforced it. Their stylus pressed against wet clay transformed abstract state power into tangible stability, binding citizen to community through legal contracts and moral conduct rather than fear alone. We often imagine the pyramids as the true foundation of ancient Egypt, those massive stone monuments that have endured for millennia. Yet the real infrastructure was invisible, composed of ink on papyrus and clay seals. This bureaucratic web did more than just record wealth, it actively constructed society's stability. Scribes held a unique privilege because their precise calculations of grain, labor, and land were not mere administrative tasks. They were the mortar that bound the state together. By enforcing contracts and defining rights, this literary economy granted ordinary citizens a tangible autonomy that stone alone could never provide. Chapter 20. The Artisan's Ledger, Deir el-Medina and the Village of Workers. Walled off from the rest of Thebes, Deir el-Medina stood as a self-contained village for the royal tomb builders. Inside these high barriers, a grid of stone homes clustered around a central granary. This structure was more than architecture. It created a unique social microcosm where the workers lived by their own rules, forging an identity distinct from the pharaoh's grand hierarchy outside. The scribe's stylus scratched against the rough pottery shard, documenting the irregular payments that sustained the valley artisans. Each entry listed sacks of emmer wheat, jars of thick beer, bundles of dried fish, and blocks of rendered fat. These state rations were their sole wealth, a precarious lifeline far removed from land ownership. The inventory was meticulously recorded to track shortages and thefts, reminding every worker that their security depended entirely on the unpredictable flow of supplies from the royal necropolis, rather than any independent economic power. The workers gathered at the temple gate, refusing to enter the Valley of the Kings because their grain rations had been delayed for weeks. On the wall, they painted a stark message: "We are hungry." This collective refusal halted royal tomb construction, proving that these skilled artisans were not passive subjects, but active negotiators who could leverage their irreplaceable skills against the state hierarchy. Inside the village walls, a unique legal microcosm thrived. Workers did not wait for royal judgment. They took their disputes to the local Kenbet court. Ostraca shards reveal cases of stolen timber and broken contracts. This system offered due process unavailable to unskilled labourers elsewhere. Legal standing was earned through specialised skill, transforming the workforce into a self-governing community with its own justice. Deir el-Medina's walls enclosed more than just homes and workshops. They sheltered a unique social experiment where skilled artisans wielded economic power far beyond their official status. While the rest of Egypt's workforce remained tethered to state rations and corvée duty, these tomb painters possessed something rare and tangible: private land. Archaeological evidence reveals that workers at Deir el-Medina owned plots outside the village walls, cultivating vineyards and orchards for personal profit. This material wealth, derived directly from their specialized craft, allowed them to accumulate assets that general laborers could never dream of owning. Their high-value skills translated into genuine mobility, proving that within this closed community, status was not merely a hierarchy imposed by the state, but an asset built brick by brick, vine by vine. The unskilled corvée laborers were merely temporary tools, conscripted and expendable, their lives held together by bread rations that could vanish overnight. In stark contrast, the artisans of Deir el-Medina stood as a permanent professional class. Their specialized skills granted them not just survival, but tangible property, legal standing, and an enduring voice within the state's towering machinery. Beyond the palace walls, the workers carved their own world into rock. Casual sketches and religious jokes filled tomb entrances. These graffiti were not mere doodles, but vital threads in a social fabric. They allowed laborers to complain, laugh, and pray together. This informal network of shared humor and faith created a buffer against state exploitation. It bound them tightly, proving their unity was as strong as the stone they shaped. Behind Deir el-Medina's walls, a distinct society emerged, operating by its own rules far from the state's direct gaze. Unlike forced corvée laborers, these skilled artisans held unique agency, funded by their specialized trade. They carved personal family chapels into the Valley of the Kings, not for pharaohs, but for themselves. These modest shrines marked a profound shift, ordinary workers transitioning from subjects to autonomous citizens, claiming space in history. Chapter 21: The Invisible Grid, Women, Children, and the Domestic Economy. In a sun-drenched courtroom in ancient Thebes, a woman named Khnoumet steps forward to finalize a transaction. She's not merely accompanying a husband or father, but acting entirely on her own behalf. With ink and a reed pen, she signs her name to a legal deed. The document explicitly states that she acts as her own mistress, transferring a portion of her inherited linen stock directly to a local baker. This was not an exception, but a standard reality for Egyptian women, who held the unique legal capacity to own property, initiate lawsuits, and conduct commerce independently without male oversight. Their rights were operational tools of daily survival, contrasting sharply with neighboring Athens, where such actions would have been impossible. Khnoumet stepped into the cool darkness of the underground storeroom, the air thick with the dry scent of ancient emmer wheat. Her fingers traced the cracked clay seal on the largest jar, checking it against her private tally. In this moment, she was not just a wife, but the CEO of a small industrial empire. The grain determined survival, and she alone held the keys to the locks. Above the sleeping mat rested a small, dark green faience statue of Bez, the dwarf god with a lion's mane and a protruding tongue. Khnoumet adjusted his position slightly, ensuring he faced the room's entrance. This was not the grand, stone-built sanctuaries of state temples where priests chanted for kings. Instead, this was a private, domestic shield against the chaotic spirits that preyed on infants in the dark. The faience glinted in the dim light, a silent, ceramic guardian standing between the vulnerable child and the unseen dangers that lurked just beyond the woven matting of the home. It was a tangible promise that safety began at the threshold of the bed. Kernamet watched Iset kneel beside her younger sister, whose body still bore the heavy toll of childbirth. The senior midwife applied cooling herbal pastes to inflamed skin, her fingers steady despite the heat. She chanted low incantations, a blend of practical poultice and spiritual warding. In this compound, women sustained life through specialized knowledge that formal doctors rarely touched. They guarded biological continuity against infection's silent threat, blending medicine with ritual in every breath. Knumet steps carefully near a patched section of the mud brick floor, where small broken pottery shards mark an informal burial site. This quiet moment acknowledges the high infant mortality rate and the physical integration of death into the domestic architecture, contrasting with the formal cemeteries outside the city. Beyond Knumet's private quarters lay a wider courtyard teeming with life. Her unmarried sisters moved between tasks, their laughter mingling with the rhythmic sounds of work. Nearby, her elderly mother-in-law sat in the shade, offering quiet guidance to the younger generation. This was not an isolated nuclear home, but an extended family unit functioning as both labor pool and social safety net. Such multi-generational cohesion provided economic resilience, distinguishing ordinary Egyptian compounds from the solitary households found elsewhere in the ancient world. Knumet's young son sat at the low table, his finger tracing lines on a practice tablet. He was not learning poetry or law, but basic arithmetic for future household accounting. This illustrates how children were trained for immediate economic utility within the home, before any formal apprentices. The heavy wooden latch clicked shut, sealing Knumet's private deeds and inventory keys within the chest. She stood alone in the sun-warmed courtyard, looking not at walls, but at a living economic entity. This home was no passive shelter. It was a legal construct, bound by contract and sustained by labor. Her authority here was real. The family's collective work fueled her autonomy, turning domestic life into a tangible engine of power. Law, economy, and kinship were inseparable in this microcosm. She was the pivot around which their world turned. Chapter 22. The architect of the afterlife, the mason, the stonecutter, and the price of eternity. Kaye grips the copper chisel against the unforgiving limestone as the midday sun beats down on his shoulders. The air around him is heavy, thick with invisible silica dust that every breath drags deep into his lungs. He pauses, chest heaving, to suppress a violent cough that rattles his ribs and leaves him wheezing for air. His joints ache with a chronic grinding pain, already deformed from years of leverage. The stone offers no resistance, mirroring the rigid, unyielding cost etched into his own body. Kaye watched the quarryman struggle under the weight of imported Aswan granite. The laborer's spine, permanently misaligned from lifting loads far beyond human limits, bowed like a broken arch. Nearby, Kaye's own gnarled hands trembled as he cleaned his tools, stiff joints protesting the repetitive strain of shaping the stone. He felt the bitter irony. Though the mason stood higher in the social hierarchy than the quarryman, treated with slightly more respect for his skill, their bodies betrayed them equally. Both men paid the same heavy price for eternity. Their physical degradation, a silent testament to the enduring cost of building monuments that would outlast their suffering. Kaye stood frozen as the chief of works examined the newly dressed limestone face. His calloused fingers traced every curve, hunting for microscopic flaws. To Kaye, a scratch was not just poor craft, it was spiritual danger. One imperfection could offend the tomb owner's ka and ruin his own legacy forever. The weight of immortal standards pressed on his shoulders. Kaye walked home, clutching the week's wages for masonry work. His hands were rough, but his pockets were heavy with grain and beer, far better than a farmer could hope for in the same season. Yet as he approached his modest brick house, the math of survival began to loom. He thought of his aging father, breathing heavily in the dim interior. The natron needed for preservation was scarce, and the linen shroud expensive. Every grain of wheat earned today seemed to vanish before it could touch his lips. It was a cruel paradox. High wages meant nothing when the cost of eternal rest consumed every copper coin. Kai stood before his friend's half-dressed tomb, walls unfinished, an entrance narrowed by budget cuts. Stone blocks were too expensive or unavailable. He saw the hesitation in the wife's eyes, a compromise between ambition and poverty. Grand designs had vanished, replaced by smaller graves etched into rock, marking financial constraints visible to all. Kai returns home, coins heavy in his pouch. Grand tombs are impossible debts. He buys a small clay figurine and modest stele instead. This is no vanity project. It is desperate budgeting for the afterlife. With wealthy heirs out of reach, this tiny investment becomes his only hope to ensure his spirit survives, sustained by the memory of a family he knows can never afford more. Kai stands before the tomb he built for a noble, his hand resting on smooth stone meant to outlast empires. Then he looks at his trembling hands and coughs into his ragged sleeve. He crafted permanence for another, while his own body decays from the labor. The monument is perfect, the builder is broken. Kai stood before his purchased stele, a humble slab barely visible against the mountain of stone rising in the distance. It represented the sum total of his sacrifice, the debt in his ledger, and the dust settling deep within his lungs. Eternity was not a gift for the commoner, but a heavy tax paid in blood and bone. Chapter 23. The Merchant's Gambit. Trade, credit, and social mobility in ordinary society. At the bustling Theban market, value was measured in weight, not face value. A vendor carefully balanced a jar of olive oil against copper rings on a bronze scale. There were no coins yet, so buyers and sellers trusted only what they could see and feel. Each shekel represented real power, tangible and immediate. In this physical exchange, ordinary people found a direct path to social mobility, independent of the state's rigid grain rations. The baker's scales groaned under the weight of copper, but his shelves were empty, and his customers needed bread now. He could not accept more metal. So he turned to his neighbor, a man who held surplus grain and trusted his reputation. They did not bother with a scribe or a formal contract sealed by an official stamp. Instead, the baker picked up a shard of pottery, an ostrakon, and scratched out the terms in haste. This was their bank. His word was the collateral. If he defaulted, he lost more than grain. He lost his standing in the market, which meant starvation. In these tight-knocked streets, trust was the only currency that never devalued. Carpenters and potters gathered not for prayer, but for profit. They met in quiet corners, away from the temple's gaze, to discuss material prices with cold pragmatism. By pooling their labor, they formed a shield against wealthy landowners who sought to suppress wages. This collective association gave them leverage no isolated worker could possess. Their professional identity became a tool of negotiation, allowing them to dictate terms and secure fair pay in a system designed to exploit individual fragility. A boatman adjusted his grip on the tiller, calculating the steep premium for downstream transport. The cargo of fragile pottery required careful handling, but the real cost lay in the unpredictable river. Seasonal delays could trap goods for weeks. Pirates lurked in hidden coves, demanding tribute from every passing vessel. Theft was common along the bends where patrols rarely ventured. These logistical dangers were baked into every price. Risk created value in this fluid economy. The boatman knew that uncertainty was the true currency. His fee covered not just distance, but danger. Each mile downstream carried hidden costs woven into the fabric of trade. Value emerged from peril. The irony was sharp in ancient economies. Merchants amassed vast fortunes through trade, yet society viewed them with deep suspicion. Landowning elites despised these disruptors of hierarchy, seeing commerce as vulgar and unstable. Yet wealth had a way of softening rigid social barriers. A successful trader could bribe officials or marry into established families. This tension reveals how commerce quietly undermined traditional status, allowing money to bypass bloodlines in ways no law could quite contain. When a ship bearing Levantine cedar docks at the harbor, the ripple effects are immediate and severe. The state claims the finest logs for its temples, but the sudden spike in timber prices drives up the cost of construction materials across the city. Local merchants find their inventory values shifting overnight, proving that even independent traders cannot shield themselves from the unpredictable tides of international commerce. A global decision made in a distant court now dictates the price of wood and wool on every local marketplace stall. The scales tipped decisively, settling on a weight of copper that felt substantial in the merchant's palm. Grain reserves were carefully tallied against the ledger, ensuring every bushel contributed to his growing capital. This quiet accumulation bypassed the rigid gates of state bureaucracy, allowing wealth to build without royal approval. For those excluded from official appointments, this independent commerce became a rare path towards social mobility and lasting security. State labor offered spiritual hope through suffering, a heavy yoke of dependency. The merchant weighed copper on his scales, feeling the immediate weight of real value. This tangible exchange built independence. No gods demanded this work, only skill and negotiation dictated the outcome. Commerce provided a distinct path to security. While the laborer prayed for relief, the trader purchased his own social elevation, transforming risk into tangible personal agency and lasting mobility. Chapter 24. The Body Politic, Soldiers, Palace Staff, and the Architecture of Power. In the chill of a northern border garrison, a low-ranking scribe bends over his desk, the scratching of his reed stylus against papyrus marking the rhythm of imperial control. He catalogues copper ingots and Levantine wool, weighing each merchant by name and burden. This is not mere bureaucracy, it is the vital infrastructure of state power. By recording every transaction, the administration transforms raw wealth into regulated obligation, weaving individual commerce into the broader tapestry of cosmic order through the quiet, unyielding enforcement of tax and documentation. The foot soldier stands in the baking heat of the Nubian fortress, watching his monthly ration of grain and beer get counted by a bored overseer. It is steady food, guaranteed by the state's endless machinery. He glances toward the horizon where a merchant caravan trudges past, their camels laden with silver, risking death for profit. The soldier calculates the weight of his security against the terrifying potential of that wealth, illustrating two divergent paths through life. In the palace stables, a charioteer, an elite commoner, trained his mount with focused precision. Clad in fine linen rather than the coarse cotton worn by foot soldiers, he occupied a higher social tier due to his specialized skill. Yet this elevated status came with terrifying fragility. One misstep in battle meant certain death, marking his life as one of constant physical danger and precarious existence. In the shadowed courtyards of the capital, a eunuch moved with practiced silence, carrying imperial edicts to distant governors. His attire marked him as an indispensable intermediary between throne and province. Yet his status was a fragile thing. Stripped of family lineage, he had no ancestral shield against the court's shifting whims. Unlike the veteran soldier who returned to his granted land, this man owned only his immediate usefulness. He embodied service without security, bridging the ruler's will and provincial reality through the perilous gap between absolute authority and earthly survival. The soldier returned from the Levant coughing blood, his body ravaged by foreign fevers unknown to Egypt. He whispered of Baal and Astarte, gods who demanded sacrifice, not ma'at. His comrades crossed themselves in fear. The disease challenged their world. Foreign contact had eroded their insular faith, leaving them vulnerable to chaos and doubt. Retired from duty, the old soldier laid his land grant deed on the table. This parchment was not mere paper. It represented a concrete asset, a tangible elevation of status impossible for palace servants. While eunuchs remained bound by subservience and lack of lineage, this veteran held a rare key to social ascent. His military service had purchased him a home. He was now a minor landholder, a man who owned the earth beneath his feet, unlike those who served only from fear. The soldier guards the border, the charioteer maintains the royal procession, and the eunuch secures the inner palace, each bound by a personal contract with the state. Across these diverse settings, the scribe watches silently, his ledger defining their worth. Their identities are not merely cultural, but contractual. defined entirely by their utility to the state's enforcement of order. In the ancient world, identity was not merely a birthright, but a contract. Every merchant's route, every soldier's patrol, and every tax ledger wove together the invisible threads of Ma'at. These mundane interactions, risky, calculated, and strictly enforced by human hands, sustained the cosmic order. The palace stood firm because the people moved with purpose, defining their standing not in the afterlife, but in the heavy, stabilizing weight of earthly obligation. Chapter 25. The Weight of the Harvest, Ration Economics and Social Credit. The granary official pours emmer wheat into the standardized kapat vessel, its level precisely aligned with the rim. This exact measure of grain is not merely food, it is currency. He tallies the volume, converting each unit into a specific count of flat loaves and narrow-mouthed beer jars. These physical goods become the universal wage, the tangible proof of value that sustains the team of laborers who move the stones for him. At Deir el-Medina, the scribe of the tomb turned labor into literal currency. Each morning he measured daily work hours with precise, unyielding logic on ostraca. These clay shards formed an inescapable paper trail, where every extra shift added to a worker's ration surplus, while missed days immediately carved out debts. The bureaucracy was not abstract, it was the visible mechanism of survival, turning sweat into grain and time into tangible, monitored accountability for every ordinary laborer. The daily ration dictated survival for the laborers, who chewed coarse bread riddled with grit and drank sour beer to slake their thirst. This abrasive diet eroded their teeth over time, sapping sustained energy. Meanwhile, scribes and overseers enjoyed the luxury of sifted flour and honey-sweetened beer or fine wine, preserving their dental health and maintaining sharper focus for their administrative duties. When the ostraca ledger marked a debt, shame followed instantly. Workers faced legal liability for unpaid rations or lost tools. To balance the books, they took secondary labor or sold family assets. Copper rings emerged as vital secondary currency, offering a tangible way to repay what grain and time could not cover in times of crisis. For the working class, beer was not a luxury, but a daily requirement for survival. It provided essential calories and safe hydration, making it the true currency of the common folk. Women brewed it in household cells or bought it from temple stores. This stood in stark contrast to wine, which remained an exclusive privilege of the elite, highlighting the deep economic divide that defined ancient social life. When the royal granaries ran empty, workers and scribes stopped working. They knew their hunger could starve the state. The delay was not just an inconvenience, but a leverage point. By withholding labor, they forced administrators to prioritize their rations, proving that food security, not divine right, upheld social order in ancient Egypt. When state ledgers failed to cover daily caloric needs, a secondary economy emerged in the shadows of the granaries. Artisans and laborers turned to copper rings known as debans to weigh out their surplus grain. These heavy coils served as tangible currency, allowing neighbors to barter bread, beer, or tools when official rations fell short. This pragmatic weight standard bridged the gap between subsistence and survival, ensuring that even amidst fiscal instability, the essential exchanges of local life continued unbroken by debt. Beyond grain, the ration ledgers revealed a complex nutritional economy defining social standing. Laborers received onions, garlic, leeks, and fish, while priests enjoyed premium oil and finer beers. This stark disparity in quality highlights how state control translated into distinct dietary realities, grounding economic security in the physical nourishment of every class. Chapter 26. The Ritual of Bread, Feeding the Dead and the Living. Before the sun crested the eastern hills, Seneb climbed the steep path to the village necropolis. His arms ached with the weight of fresh emmer loaves, dried onions, and a clay jar of cool beer. He carefully arranged these offerings in the niche above his father's tomb entrance, ensuring the bread was soft and untouched by the dust. This daily ritual was not merely habit, it was a desperate safeguard against spiritual oblivion. With each loaf placed, Seneb reinforced the fragile bridge between the living and the dead, binding their fates through tangible, material exchange in the quiet, pre-dawn silence. For 3 long years, Seneb maintained a copper ledger, recording every measure of grain saved for the afterlife. This stone stela demanded more than simple craft. It required converting vital harvest reserves into precious metal. His family diverted resources from immediate survival to secure their posthumous status, turning agricultural labor into eternal security through careful, calculated sacrifice. Seneb's fingers traced the cold stone of his stela, following the precise lines of the invocation formula he had commissioned. This was the Hetep di Nesu, a standardized liturgy that claimed a king-given feast for the afterlife. For Seneb, the true power lay not in the physical oxen or bread that would never materialize, but in the words themselves. By reciting this text, he theoretically sustained a vast, invisible household of ancestors without lifting a single finger to provide their daily sustenance. While Seneb toiled under the Egyptian sun at the construction site, his household did not idle. His wife Merit assumed control of the domestic shrine, a critical duty that demanded constant attention. She refilled the water vessels with fresh Nile streams and lit the fragrant incense every morning. This daily labor was not merely routine. It sustained the spiritual connection to her husband while imposing a significant economic burden on their family. While impoverished neighbors left simple clay amulets as symbolic gestures, Seneb's literacy allowed him to activate his stone stela through spoken words alone. This sacred shortcut bypassed the physical labor of constant food provisioning, transforming education into a luxury that significantly reduced the economic burden of maintaining connections with the dead. When archaeologists brush away the dirt from commoner homes, they find broken bread molds and leftover grains in tiny domestic shrines. This is not a grand public spectacle of feeding the dead. It is a messy, daily reality. For ordinary people, maintaining this connection required constant labor. Every loaf baked was a promise kept, turning abstract grief into tangible physical acts woven into the very fabric of household life. For Seneb, the terrifying silence of oblivion was not an abstract fear, but a daily debt owed to his ancestors. He understood that memory required currency. By feeding them through offerings, he bought their continued presence in his home, transforming spiritual anxiety into economic obligation, where every loaf of bread and jar of wine served as a binding contract against being forgotten. As Seneb finished his daily duties at the tomb, he recognized that these acts were not mere rituals, but the very threads binding his family to ancestors and descendants. This enforced obligation defined who they were. Their identity emerged not from abstract theology, but from this complex web of duty. The cosmic order remained stable only because ordinary people like him kept feeding the past, ensuring memory survived against oblivion. Chapter 27. The Doctor's Hand. Healing as Spiritual and Medical Practice. In the dusty village clinic, the physician prepared a poultice of myrrh and opium for a laborer with a broken rib. He focused on anatomical alignment and the drying properties of honey bandages, dismissing the patient's fear that his pain was a spiritual curse. When herbs failed, the desperate sought Sekhmet's shrine. Here, no poultice existed for the vomiting woman. Instead, a priest-healer drew protective symbols in ash upon her forehead. He chanted the specific incantation against Serket, the demon blamed for such torment. This ritual aimed to exorcise the spiritual cause of her affliction through sound and symbol. In a dimly lit room, the midwife placed a small wooden statuette of Bez at the foot of the birthing stool, a silent guardian against chaos. As the mother labored, she carefully cleansed the newborn with natron, the sharp salt-preserving hygiene and warding off infection. But physical care was only half the battle. She chanted low invocations, weaving words to drive away evil spirits hungry for the vulnerable child. Here, women served as the critical bridge between the biological reality of birth and the spiritual dread that haunted every household. Beyond the domestic sphere, the body faced a different set of trials from daily labor. Stonecutters breathed silica dust that slowly turned lungs to stone. Farmers wading in Nile waters contracted schistosomiasis, leaving limbs swollen and heavy. Scribes, heads bent for hours, rubbed eyes raw from reed pen strain. Each ailment was an occupational hazard, a direct tax on the body for the sake of industry. In this society, health was a commodity strictly dictated by wealth. When laborers fell ill from exhaustion, their families drained meager savings on liniments and temple offerings, hoping for divine mercy. Meanwhile, nobles spent fortunes on gold wire to stabilize loose teeth. The disparity revealed that survival itself required draining economic resources, turning every physical ailment into a financial crisis that only the rich could truly afford. The laborer lay awake, listening to the rattle in his chest, but it was not pain that kept him staring into the dark. It was fear. Every cough felt like a judgment, a divine penalty for a minor breach of Ma'at he had committed long ago. He did not see biology, he saw moral failure. The illness was not just a sickness of the body, but a crisis of the soul, where every breath became a test of his spiritual purity and a reminder that the gods were watching. Cleanliness was not merely a preference for the elite scribe, but a sacred duty. He would retreat to the communal bath, scrubbing his skin with natron to purify his body against invisible disease spirits. For him, purity was a shield. Contrast this with the laborer, whose water ration was scarce and shared by all. His body remained coated in dust and mud, an open invitation for parasites and infection. Hygiene became the ultimate class divider, determining who faced death and who survived the unseen threats of ancient life. The commoner carried the herbal poultice from the village physician, its scent mingling with incense from Sekhmet's shrine. He paused at the local altar, placing a small offering for the gods before applying the medicine to his wound. This ritual was not superstition alone, but a calculated necessity. Hygiene provided the first barrier, yet it was incomplete. True healing required appeasing divine forces while treating the body empirically. The patient survived not through one method, but by negotiating with both biology and spirit. Chapter 28. The weight of the ostraca, literacy, ledger, and legal defense in ordinary society. In the cooling shade of the massive granary walls, scribe Amenemopet remains comfortably seated, far removed from the blistering sun that beats down on the laborers hauling heavy sacks of barley and emmer wheat. He holds a rough ostraca in one hand, grinding black charcoal dust with water to create his ink. With deliberate, practiced movements, he sketches angular numerals across the pottery shard, drafting the initial calculation of the farmer's yield against the state's demanding tax quota. This quiet moment of administrative preparation marks the precise point where abstract accounting transforms into tangible sustenance, establishing Amenemopet's elevated social status as the essential gatekeeper of the kingdom's resources and the vital link between agricultural output and the citizenry's survival. Keti stood in the cool dimness of the storehouse, his eyes fixed not on the grain itself, but on the rigid geometry of the state's accounting. He held the standard kepat, a vessel carved to exact dimensions, its wooden walls scarred by centuries of precise use. This was not merely farming, it was the translation of harvest into bureaucracy. He scooped the emmer wheat, leveling the surface with a flat stick, ensuring every grain matched the previous one and the next. The farmer watched, knowing his labor was now just a number in a ledger. Weight measured in deben, volume in kepet, the abstract tax became tangible property. The uniformity of this standard bound the region together, turning chaotic nature into predictable state revenue, where the numerical value mattered far more than the taste or texture of the grain filling the vessel. High in the cool, dim air of the mud brick granary, Keti watched his scribes work with intense focus. They were not just recording numbers on wet clay, they were guarding the city's future against invisible enemies. Rot and beetles threatened every ear of wheat, turning promised bread into useless dust. Scribes monitored ventilation shafts with a vigilance usually reserved for military forts, tracking rodent activity as a critical metric. A single hole in the wall could mean starvation come harvest time. The abstract value of grain relied entirely on this brutal daily war against decay and theft. The scribe watched the water level rise against the Nilometer's stone wall. This was not merely rain or flood, but raw capital waiting to be counted. He dipped his reed brush into the inkwell, translating the rising tide into columns of grain and gold. Every inch of submerged earth meant a proportional increase in the state's cut. The numbers on his papyrus grew heavier as the Nile climbed higher. Behind him, the city slept unaware that their future security was already being calculated in this quiet room, bound by arithmetic before the harvest was ever reaped. For Nefer, the written contract was more than paper. It was tangible security in a world of shifting alliances. While his neighbor hesitated over oral promises, Nefer's scribe translated debt into precise terms. Grain, tools, and dates were locked in ink. This documentation transformed vulnerability into leverage, ensuring that even an artisan could demand respect against exploitation through the cold, enduring power of verified records. The worker arrives at the granary gates, clutching a stamped papyrus ticket. This small scroll is not merely paper, it is proof of labor. It translates his agricultural contribution into immediate sustenance. The scribe inspects the seal, verifying the debt paid to the state. With a decisive stamp, the document gains value. In that moment, abstract taxation becomes tangible bread and beer, bridging the gap between civic duty and human survival for one hungry citizen. While farmers trembled at the reed stylus, scribes held the power of exemption. Their literacy was not merely skill but armor, shielding them from the grain quotas that bound the commoner. They measured others' fields while standing safely above the mud, their words defining reality for those who lacked even the ink to dispute it. Nefer's signed contract was not merely a private agreement, but a vital node within a vast, state-enforced web of obligation. In this society, identity was defined by one's standing in the official ledgers, debts owed and rations claimed. The stability of Ma'at relied on this constant human enforcement through legal records, ensuring that social order persisted long after death. Chapter 29. The Scribe's Ledger. The Weight of the Reed Brush. Authority in ancient Egypt was not merely abstract, it was tactile. Before a decree could bind the realm, junior scribes like Khayyam Waset labored over raw materials. He ground lapis lazuli and soot with gum arabic, creating rich ink from stone and dust. Beneath his hands, papyrus sheets were hammered flat by the rhythmic thud of his mallet, smoothing the fiber into a durable surface. This sensory preparation, the grinding of pigments, the pressing of reeds, transformed chaotic nature into ordered record. Only then did the written word gain its power to enforce social order and preserve the state's memory against the erosion of time. Overseer Patamos stood among 10 scribes, his eyes sharp for error. He sorted their work into a strict hierarchy. Simple grain tallies went to eager apprentices, teaching them the rhythm of numbers. Complex contracts and legal nuances were handed only to senior experts. This system ensured every document held weight, turning raw labor into enduring social order through the careful hand of the skilled. In the quiet heart of the state storehouses, Patamos stood amidst towering piles of emmer wheat. With steady hands, he filled standard kapat baskets, ensuring each scoop met the precise weight required by law. This was no mere chore, it was an act of defining value. He marked the yield on a rough ostraka shard first, a temporary note before the formal inventory. The dust swirled in the shafts of light as he calculated the kingdom's wealth, one grain at a time. Every measure was a promise, every number, a binding contract that transformed wild harvest into civilized order. The air in the office was thick with the sharp scent of pine resin and soot, grounding the abstract weight of law in physical reality. A small landowner stood before the scribe, unrolling a fragile papyrus that served as his only shield against a neighboring estate's aggressive claim. Patamos examined the document with practiced calm, his attention fixed on the meticulous boundary descriptions inked onto the page and, most importantly, the distinctive wax seal of the Royal Archives at its base. This was not merely paper, it was a tangible artifact of state authority, transforming literacy from a passive skill into an active economic weapon. For the common farmer, the presence of that seal meant the difference between retaining his livelihood or losing everything to the whims of a powerful neighbor. Tamose dipped his reed pen into the inkwell, drafting a marriage contract for a newlywed couple. He carefully listed the specific property transfers from the groom's estate to the bride, ensuring her financial autonomy if he died. In a world where law was often impersonal and distant, this document served as a tangible shield, protecting individual rights within the intimate confines of family life. In the dusty archives, ink-stained fingers trembled as a junior scribe realized his arithmetic error. A single miscalculation had shaved pounds from grain rations due to the temple stores. For him, this was not merely administrative inefficiency, but a direct threat of the rod. The overseer's silence was heavier than any shout, transforming mathematical precision into a matter of personal survival and social standing. Tamorze dipped his reed stylus into the wet ink, the black sludge smelling of charcoal and vinegar. With deliberate care, he pressed the tip onto the papyrus, etching the day's wage for each laborer. This was not merely an administrative task, but a profound act of binding. As the ink dried, it transformed physical toil into legal debt. The workers received their paper tokens, while the state secured its claim on their bodies. Through these fragile sheets, personal rights and public obligation became inextricably linked, weaving a tight web of mutual duty that held the society together with the quiet power of written law. The reed pen lifted from the tray, leaving a damp, dark trace on the papyrus. Patamos watched the ink dry, realizing this was not mere record-keeping. Each stroke carved reality into existence, binding neighbor to neighbor through contract and law. The wax seal pressed down with finality. In that moment, the scribe understood his power. He did not just observe history, he enforced it. His careful handwriting defined rights, debts, and identities for the coming year. The ink was dry, but its influence would echo through every household, securing social order. Chapter 30: The Enduring Household, Domestic Continuity and Family Legacy. The commoner's home was not merely a shelter, but a living engine of continuity. 3 generations wove their daily rhythms into the same stone walls. Grandparents rested near the central courtyard, positioned precisely to receive water and medicine without traversing cold halls. Married sons occupied adjacent wings, close enough to hear a call for help, yet private enough to maintain their own small domains. This architectural intimacy ensured that care flowed automatically, binding economic survival to familial duty. In this multi-generational home, physical closeness promised deep integration and continuity. A married daughter managed a chest of linens she personally wove. She retained legal title to her dowry assets, supporting her own household independently of her husband's family. This separate economic stream ensured resources remained within the maternal line. It created a parallel structure to patriarchal will, acting as the permanent link between lines and ensuring diversity within the expanding clan. The father weighed his son's quiet aptitude against the family ledger, seeing a future far brighter than calloused hands in a workshop. With a pragmatic smile, he steered the younger boy toward the scribe's table, prioritizing intellectual earnings over traditional crafts, while ensuring his daughter's dowry secured their parallel economic strength. Marriage was never just romance. It was a cold, calculated merger of 2 ordinary households. Fathers negotiated grain stores and labor rights, turning daughters into assets to expand their economic web. This strategic alliance stabilized livelihoods, weaving tight social networks that bound families together through shared resources and mutual obligation, ensuring survival in a harsh village economy where every bushel of wheat counted toward the future of the lineage. The patriarch unrolls the fresh papyrus, ink still glistening under the lamplight. He carefully partitions the family estate with precise strokes: a plowshare for the eldest son, a modest land plot for the second, and distinct household shrines allocated to each daughter. This legal document acts as a structural skeleton, preventing future fractures by distributing resources while keeping wealth within the maternal line, ensuring the household survives his physical absence. At the household shrine, daily rituals anchored the family's spiritual survival. Members took turns offering fresh water while reciting the deceased grandfather's name. This verbal acknowledgement was not mere ceremony, but essential sustenance for his spirit. By integrating this act with legal inheritance practices, they ensured continuity through both material stability and active remembrance, binding the living and dead in a reciprocal relationship of enduring care. In the bustling heart of the village, a family's existence was defined not by individual desire, but by a complex web of obligations. Legal contracts bound sons to specific trades, securing their economic future through hard labor and skill acquisition. Daughters, meanwhile, held fixed dowry rights that ensured asset retention within the lineage, creating a stable foundation for marriage alliances. These ties expanded social networks, pooling resources, and reinforcing moral duties across generations. Every member's identity was anchored in these reciprocal expectations, transforming personal roles into essential threads of community survival. This intricate balance of law, duty, and social standing allowed ordinary Egyptians to navigate life's uncertainties, ensuring that the family unit remained resilient against the passage of time and the demands of royal authority. The cramped, multi-generational home was more than shelter. It was a fortress of care, ensuring that economic strategies and spiritual beliefs reinforced one another daily. Sons navigated the fluid pressures of occupational economics, while daughters secured fixed assets through rigid dowry laws, creating a balanced system of stability. When death approached, anxiety was not left to fate, but managed through precise legal wills and the rhythmic daily utterance of ancestral names. This constant practice linked material inheritance with metaphysical survival, proving that continuity was built on both paper and prayer. Ordinary Egyptians wove a complex web of social obligations, far from passive subjects, actively engineering their legacy. They were not static relics, but dynamic agents, using family as an engine to outlast the individual and secure their place in history.